I'm reading Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, paragraph 712. The son who is born of these heavenly nuptials is perforce a complexio oppositorum, a uniting symbol, a totality of life. John's unconscious, certainly not without reason, borrowed from Greek mythology in order to describe this strange eschatological experience, for it was not on any account to be confused with the birth of the Christ child, which had occurred long before, under quite different circumstances, though obviously the allusion is to the wrathful Lamb, i.e. the Apocalyptic Christ. The newborn manchild is represented as his duplicate, as one who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. He is thus assimilated to the predominant feelings of hatred and vengeance, so that it looks as if he will needlessly continue to wreak his judgment even in the distant future. This interpretation does not seem consistent because the Lamb is already charged with this task. In the course of the revelation, carries it so far to an end without the newborn manchild ever having an opportunity to act on his own. He never reappears afterward. I am therefore inclined to believe that the depiction of him as a son of vengeance, if it is not an interpolation, must have been a little familiar phrase of John, and that it slipped out as the obvious interpretation. This is the more probable in that the intermezzo could not, at the time, have been understood in any other way, even though this interpretation is quite meaningless. As I have already pointed out, the sun-woman episode is a foreign body in the flow of the visions. Therefore, I believe it is not too far-fetched to conjecture that the author of the Apocalypse, or perhaps a perplexed transcriber, felt the need to interpret this obvious parallel with Christ and somehow bring it into line with the text as a whole. This could easily be done by using the familiar image of the shepherd with the iron crook. I cannot see any other reason for this association. Paragraph 713. Hold on to your hats. This is a Humdinger. The man-child is caught up to God, who is manifestly his father, and the mother is hidden in the wilderness. This would seem to indicate that the child figure will remain latent for an indefinite time, and that its activity is reserved for the future. The story of Hagar may be a prefiguration of this. The similarity between the story and the birth of Christ obviously means no more than the birth of the man-child is an analogous event, like the previously mentioned enthronement of the Lamb in all his metaphysical glory, which must have taken place long before at the time of the Ascension. In the same way, the dragon, i.e. the devil, is described as being thrown down to earth. Footnote, Revelation 12:9. Although Christ had already observed the fall of Satan very much earlier. This strange repetition or duplication of the characteristic events in Christ's life gave rise to the conjecture that a second Messiah is to be expected at the end of the world. What is meant here cannot be the return of Christ himself, for we are told that he would come in the clouds of heaven, but not be born a second time, and certainly not from a sun-moon conjunction. The Epiphany at the end of the world corresponds more to the content of Revelation 1 and 19, 11, and following. The fact that John uses the myth of Leto and Apollo in describing the birth may be an indication that the vision, in contrast to the Christian tradition, is a product of the unconscious. Footnote, it is very probable that John knew the Leto Myth and used it consciously. What was unconscious and most unexpected, however, was the fact that his unconscious used this pagan myth to describe the birth of the second Messiah. But in the unconscious is everything that has been rejected by consciousness. And the more Christian one's consciousness is, the more heathenishly does the unconscious behave. If in the rejected heathenism there are values which are important for life, if, that is to say, the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater, as so often happens. The unconscious does not isolate or differentiate its objects as consciousness does. It does not think abstractly or apart from the subject. The person of the ecstatic or visionary is always drawn into the process and included in it. In this case, it is John himself whose unconscious personality is more or less identified with Christ. That is to say, he is born like Christ and born to a like destiny. John is so completely captivated by the archetype of the divine Son that he sees its activity in the unconscious. In other words, he sees God is born again in the partly pagan unconscious, indistinguishable from the self of John, since the divine child is a symbol of the one as much as the other, just as Christ is. Consciously, of course, John was very far from thinking of Christ as a symbol. For the believing Christian, Christ is everything, but certainly not a symbol, which is an expression of something unknown or not yet knowable. And yet he is a symbol by his very nature. Christ would never have made the impression he did on his followers if he had not expressed something that was alive and at work in their unconscious. Christianity itself would never have spread through the pagan world with such astonishing rapidity had its ideas not found an analogous psychic readiness to receive them. It is this fact that also makes it possible to say that whoever believes in Christ is not only contained in him, but that Christ then dwells in the believer as the perfect man formed in the image of God, the second Adam. Psychologically, it is the same relationship as that in Indian philosophy between man's ego consciousness and Purusha, or Atman. It is the ascendancy of the complete, or total, human being, consisting of the totality of the psyche, of conscious and unconscious, over the ego, which represents only consciousness and its contents and knows nothing of the unconscious, although in many respects it is dependent on the unconscious and is often decisively influenced by it. This relationship of the self to the ego is reflected in the relationship of Christ to man. Hence the unmistakable analogies between certain Indian and Christian ideas which have given rise to conjectures of Indian influence on Christianity. Paragraph 714. This parallelism, which has so far remained latent in John, now bursts into consciousness in the form of a vision. That this invasion is authentic can be seen from the use of pagan mythological material, a most improbable procedure for a Christian of that time, especially as it contains traces of astrological influence. That may explain the thoroughly pagan remark, and the earth helped the woman. Even though the consciousness of that age was exclusively filled with Christian ideas, earlier or contemporaneous pagan contents lay just below the surface, as for example in the case of St. Perpetua. With a Judeo-Christian, and the author of the Apocalypse was probably such, another possible model to be considered is the cosmic Sophia. to whom John refers on more than one occasion. She could easily be taken as the mother of the divine child. The son would then correspond to the filius sapientiae of medieval alchemy, since she is obviously a woman in heaven, i.e., a goddess or consort of a god. Sophia comes up to this definition, and so does the transfigured Mary. If the vision were a modern dream, one would not hesitate to interpret the birth of the divine child as the coming to consciousness of the self. In John's case, the conscious attitude of faith made it possible for the Christ image to be received into the material of the unconscious. It activated the archetype of the divine Virgin Mother and of the birth of her son lover, and brought it face to face with his Christian consciousness. As a result, John became personally involved in the divine drama.